Major support for these programs is provided by Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Perfect Building Maintenance, New York Community Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending. Additional support is provided by AVR Realty Company, LLC, Bingham McCutcheon, LLP, Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, Capital One Bank, Cassidy Turley, C.B. Richard Ellis, Chelsea Lighting, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, DDG Partners, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Genova Burns and Gian Tomasi, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Corman Communities, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Site Comply, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, the Wickoff Group, Urban American, and Ackman Ziff Real Estate, Ariel Property Advisors, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Goldman Properties, Moynihan Group, Muss Development, RAL Development Services, the Spandrel Group, LLC, Rosewood Realty Group, Triangle Equities.
So there are things in New York City, there is development, and a person who's been responsible for a lot of the development and the approval and the land use of this development is the legendary John Zuccotti, and that's my guest today. Thanks for being here, John.
Glad to be here, Mike. Legendary is a bit of an overstatement.
Nah, it's not.
Sounds a little bit like an obituary.
No. We're not writing the obituary. Okay, let's talk about your parents. You know, you were telling me about your grandmother, the Piedmontese, right?
Yes, yes.
Let's talk about the
Northwestern Italy.
Right, but your grandmother had a couple of husbands with great lung death.
Yeah, well, my grandmother was married to a miner in the northern part of Italy. And she had a child, my aunt, by that miner, and then they moved to Calumet, Michigan, and he was killed in the mine. And so she now was in Michigan with one child, and she went back to Italy and married another miner who, in fact, took her to Slippery Jack, South Africa, where he worked in a diamond mine, and she ran a pensione for mostly Italian workers who were there as miners. And there she had 3 more children, my aunt and uncle and my mother, who was a twin. And after his period in the mine where he made a little money, he came back to the village in Italy and to retire because he was ill. And he died of black lung disease in 1917. So there she was, still relatively young, and she, in the same village, and so she married yet a third miner. And they left Italy in 1920, and he took her to the Anaconda mine in Butte, Montana, where my mother lived for 3.5 years. And again, one day the whistle blew, very much like that movie, How Green Was My Valley. My mother always reminded me that that was the setting. And he was killed too. So now she is in Butte, Montana with 4 little children, and she decides she's going to go back to Italy. Now it's 1923, 24. And she comes to New York, and she met her cousin who lived on Bleecker Street, right across the street from Our Lady of Pompeii Church. And the cousin said, well, listen, you have 3 daughters. They're all capable sewers. They can be seamstresses. There are plenty of jobs here in New York. Why go back to Italy? The country's in turmoil right now. So she stayed, rented a apartment on Grove Street, and that's the whole story of how my grandmother got to New York City.
Now, your parents, how'd your father meet your mother?
They met, in those days, there were various, again, pensiones, places where people lived, usually single men who were working. And then once a week they'd had a little dance affair in these places. One of them was on 45th Street, which is Restaurant Row now, was one of those buildings. And he went there and met my mother, and that's how they met. And
So how did your dad get to work for the legendary El Morocco?
Well, my family had been in the restaurant business in one way or another. It was a kind of family that was interested in farming, and they had a farm in western New Jersey. And also the men of the family held jobs as waiters in restaurants in New York, so they knew their way around the restaurant business. And he was placed in a restaurant to work, and then got an opportunity as a waiter at the El Morocco, which was a speakeasy at that point. And indeed, he started out as a waiter and worked his way up to the head waitership.
And then he became the maitre d'.
That's right, exactly.
Now, one of the articles I was reading, it said that you once, were you there as a coat check, a hat check
I
man
used
once?
to work there to help in the hat check room, and usually Christmas and New Year's, right, when I would help out in the back room.
So you were in the
surrounded by this bevy of beauties, you know, all these, in those days. And it was very interesting.
Now, you grew
experience.
up in the village, right?
Yeah.
You grew up in the village. You went to Catholic school, parochial school, and then your dad wanted you to go to college.
My father wanted me to go to Lawrenceville because one of the customers at the El Morocco said that's a very good school and you should send your son there. And he
it
would
was the
introduce
prep school to
the prep school to Princeton.
Right.
And the nuns thought that was bordered on sacrilege because I was going to a non-Catholic school, and they suggested that if my family wanted to send me away to school, there were two suggestions. One was Portsmouth Prior, and the other was this school on Long Island where I went, LaSalle Military Academy.
So you graduate LaSalle Military Academy, and you go to Princeton.
I went to Princeton because Princeton had been the orientation that my father had from a customer at the El Morocco.
Now, when you were going to, when you were growing up, or when you were going to Princeton, did you realize that you wanted to become a lawyer?
It was always in my head because one of, some things you're good at and some things you're not. I was always good making speeches, talking. I was in debating all the time, and I was comfortable on my feet, and lawyering seemed to be the context for that kind of talent. So I wasn't good in math, but I was good in English and history and those kinds of things.
So you graduate Princeton, what, 57?
59.
59. And then...
I was in the military for a while.
Right, you were in the Army Reserve.
For Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
And
a
then,
cannoneer.
Yes, exactly. You went too.
That's right.
Right, I remember. We talked about it. Lovely Lawton, Oklahoma.
Right.
Garden spot of America.
141 millimeter, something like that.
105.
105 millimeter, the howitzers.
Howitzers, right.
Right. And then you...
And then I went to Yale Law School.
Right.
And I finished there in '63.
So now, at that time, you finish the Yale Law School, and you end up where? You leave the country, right?
Well, yeah.
You have an opportunity.
I had always wanted to... I always wanted to study housing, and I was particularly focused on trying to build housing for poor people. And I was interested in planning and in neighborhoods. And I sought an application and was accepted at the School for the Organization of American States in Bogota, which had a one-year program for students who are interested in graduate work in housing for poor people. They call it affordable housing today. But the professor who recommended me suggested, why work? Why go to school? There's a job available with the Joint Center for Urban Studies of Harvard and MIT. They are consultants to a Venezuelan Development Corporation, and they're building a new town in the southeastern corner of Venezuela along the Orinoco River. So in the meantime, I had been engaged, and I'd fallen in love, and my wife was she was a Rotary Fellow in Geneva, and I called her up and said, well, can you come home because we want to go to Venezuela with me? So she came home, we were married, she came home in 2 weeks, we were married, and on the 15th of June, 1963, we were married. Next day, we went to Venezuela for almost 2 years.
How Venezuela then changed to go to the Washington, D.C., to the government?
Well, I was in Washington, D.C. because the man who had been my mentor in Venezuela was a professor at MIT, and he became the Undersecretary of HUD. And when Bob Weaver, who was associated with the City University, first African-American cabinet officer, a great man, not well known, but there's a wonderful biography of his. He was the secretary, and this gentleman, Robert Wood, was the undersecretary.
And then you get a job in
And then I was his special assistant for 3 years.
How do you come back to New York?
Actually, I stayed 1 year into the Republican administration
Right, you
with George Romney, who
the
was the secretary, the father of the current Romney.
Right.
And I came back to New York, and I had a friend, and we started a firm. Peter Tufo was his name.
Went to law school with you?
He was in law school, and he was very active in the Lindsay administration, and he had worked for Mayor Lindsay as his representative in Washington, a couple of other things. He was the head of the Corrections Board. And then Mayor Lindsay asked me if I would be a member of the City Planning Commission.
Right, and you weren't you doing campaigning for
I
Mayor?
campaigned, I worked for him in 1965.
And there was a person by the name of Burden involved who was also doing campaigning?
Well, pardon me? Oh, yeah, well,
Yes.
Carter Burden, yes.
Right.
He and Amanda, we ran a storefront, and the Lindsay strategy was to open in every assembly district in the city a storefront. And usually young people ran the storefront, and you had a job at the same time, and so you phased it off to another couple, and in that
your
case
other
it
couple
was
was
Carter and
Carter and
Amanda
Amanda
Burden at that point. Yeah.
So now you said at that time there was an opportunity to get involved with the city planning if you were in Brooklyn, right?
Correct.
So how did that event take place?
Well, we had lived in Washington in a townhouse on a government. We only had a government salary, and the rent for a townhouse in Georgetown on 35th Street between O and P, 4 stories, garden in the front, garden in the back, place to park your car, was $300 a month. And so we liked the idea of living in a townhouse because it was a different kind of experience for myself because I'd lived in apartments all my life. And we looked around for a place to live, and we couldn't afford to live in Greenwich Village because a floor through was $500.
It was more than right.
And we looked in Brooklyn Heights.
A little too expensive also.
And it was expensive also. So as I told you, and I'll say what happened, the broker said, well, if you want to live with the WAPs, you can in fact, she can in fact, I don't know why she ever said that to my wife in the context of the fact that she was Mrs. Zuccotti, I don't know, but she said it, and I said that's where we're going to live. And so we moved to Carroll Gardens.
And you got the job with City Planning.
And for those fortuitous circumstances, I happened to be a resident of Brooklyn.
Which was perfect.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with the Beam administration?
I was the chairman of the Planning Commission, and in 1973, Mayor Beam won the election, and he kept me on as the chairman in his administration. And I came to have a great affection for him over the course of many years.
Because there was something written in an article that you could have ran against him for mayor, and you had this relationship, and you wouldn't run it.
Well, some people said I could have run for mayor, and I probably could have. Ed Koch loves to tell people that if I would have been mayor if I hadn't dropped out, as it were. But of course, that's not true. It's a good laugh. Right?
Now, the interesting situation, you said to me, hey, I had a family. I was living in Brooklyn. it was time to get a regular job, right? So now you go
that's
back.
true, right.
So you go back to work with your buddy Peter, right?
Yep.
And the interesting situation is, you know, when the World Trade Center was built, they took the dirt from the World Trade Center, which, you know, it's good education for people, and they took it where Battery Park City was.
Yeah.
And this guy over here, this land use attorney by the name of Zuccotti, gets involved with that, right?
Well, I was a great believer in Battery Park City, even when I was at City Planning and when I was the chairman of the City Planning Commission, and even when I was the first deputy mayor, because I thought it was an area that had to be developed and that would eventually be developed. But there was, as is often the case in New York, very little support for it in the real estate community and in political terms. If it hadn't been for Nelson Rockefeller, probably would have never happened. Charlie Erstadt, who was the first head of it, would tell you if he was on the show that I was probably his best friend in the administration, in both the Lindsay and the Beam administration. I thought that it was an area that would offer primarily residential opportunities, and that the future of Lower Manhattan to some degree rested on the fact that it would become a 24-hour community, which of course it has become. And that new construction element was very important to achieving that goal. And so Battery Park City became an important element in terms of the future of the city, in particular Lower Manhattan. As I told you, but it sat there fallow for many, many years. The first person to build on it was Sam Lefrak, and you know, he was a risk taker, and he built one building, but it took him a long time.
And he also built with federal government money.
Yes, well, it was FHA insured. I don't think he got money, but it was insured. Yeah,
insured.
But the story that I do know and I remember fondly is that I represented a man named Paul Reichman, who in another show I would take up the whole time, I think was the greatest developer of the latter part of the 20th century for many different reasons.
An interesting man from Canada who started with the tile business, right?
He did, yes, right. It's interesting, in the history of development in the latter part of the 20th century in New York, very often New Yorkers are too unwilling to take a chance with projects like this. And people from outside the city who have a greater faith in the growth and change that is born here, that is the nucleus of our
But Paul
strength.
Reichman said, he came to you. I mean, he looked for a land use attorney.
Well, he did, yes, and I had represented him, and then as I told you that he had competed for the 42nd Street project, which was an idea of the Koch administration with Herb Sturz, who was then the chairman of the Planning Commission. And he didn't want to do the project because he believed that in order to be successful, it needed to be a bigger project than the city was proposing. The city was proposing 8th to 7th Avenue, Broadway, 42nd Street. He wanted it to go all the way to 6th or even 5th Avenue. And we were downtown in City Hall discussing with Karen Gerard a tax abatement for a building that we were constructing. It was on a Friday afternoon, and I said, come on over, I want to show you something. And we went over to the World Trade Center. At the time, there was a platform where you could look across and see virtually what was called then a sandbox. And I said, there's going to be an RFP for this site to build office buildings. Maybe if you're not going to do the 42nd Street project, you might be interested in this. And he said he'd talk to me about it. About 2 weeks later, called me and said, get the papers together. I think that's something I might be interested in. And of course, he won the RFP, largely because he did something that most developers wouldn't do. He, in fact, committed to build even without a tenant, and secured his commitment with a letter of credit. So he put money on the line and won.
Right, and he built 3 major office towers, 4 office towers, and the retail.
And the retail, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the large Winter Garden complex and everything that is the World Financial Center today.
And that would open, what, 1986?
It was 86, 87, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he also, part of it was he brought some tenants over by buying other properties.
He did, he did. He brought over Merrill Lynch, which was in One Liberty Plaza, which is opposite the so-called Zuccotti Park, there, and and then he ended up owning that building, or as well, the company owned the building, and Merrill Lynch went to the World Financial Center, did the same thing with American Express.
So it's 1990, and Paul Reichman decides that he's going to go to London.
It was 88.
88,
Yeah.
and he goes to his trusted consigliere, Mr. Zuccotti, and he says, "You want to run my company in America?"
He did. He said, would I be interested in being the president of the company in the United States? He was going to go to London and undertake to do this project, Canary Wharf, which had sort of the same history as Battery Park City. It had been tried, wasn't going anywhere, and he picked up the pieces. And would I look after his U.S. interests? And I said, I'd be happy to do
Yeah,
that.
because besides Battery City, he had bought the Eurus portfolio
Well, he had in 1978.
right, which was 15 buildings, and
Right.
he had other properties, and I believe he had gone into San Francisco.
Oh, he had properties all over the country.
Right.
Yeah, all over the country.
And Canada.
And Canada. Yeah.
Right. So
all over North America.
So what year? This is 89?
89, yeah. So I
89.
became the chairman in the president, December of 1989.
And then you lived during the difficult times in the real estate
Right.
market.
And then the market collapsed, as you know, as it has from time to time, 2 or 3 times in my lifetime. And Mr. Reichman encountered serious problems in Canary Wharf because it too was affected, and because transportation system was lagging, and the theory of the location was that the new subway line, the so-called Jubilee line, which was called the Jubilee line because it was the Jubilee of the Queen, was going to be built to give access to this project, and of course it was delayed, as transportation lines are always delayed, and then the interim system was attacked by the IRA, and time and circumstance were such that he was unable to meet his financial commitments, and that resulted in a situation where we had to reorganize the U.S. company, which we did, and that would take us to 1995, 96.
And you continued to stay on as the president.
Right, and then what happened was the interests of people who are associated with Mr. Reichman, the Edgar and Peter Bronfman, which they had a series of companies in Canada. They essentially converted the debt that they held into equity in the new company. Citibank did too. They put up some capital, and after not a lot, but some pushing and shoving with some of the other investors in the company, people who had bought bonds at a discount. We emerged from a consensual reorganization, and we basically merged the real estate interests of the Bronfman Group with the remnants of the Olympia and York, and changed the name to Brookfield.
Now, you've been involved with a lot of the planning for Lower Manhattan also in the 90s over the years.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the changes of Lower Manhattan. You were involved with the J51s.
Right.
The
The thing about Lower Manhattan is, well, first of all, none of these initiatives happen overnight. They take decades. The whole idea of West Side redevelopment is a lifetime thing for me, because when I was a child, the Miller Highway was there. My dad took me to see the Normandy, which caught fire at one of our piers. And so that whole area, which was essentially a shipping and marketing center, has redone itself. It has been redeveloped, and it's still being redeveloped today, obviously. And in the South, it was able to go ahead more aggressively because of the creation of Battery Park City. But the issues of such change are still underway, and they're underway in the West Side redevelopment plan.
Right.
But I only say that because part of that strategy was to, in fact, make Lower Manhattan a 24-hour community. That was articulated in David Rockefeller's Lower Manhattan plan in the 1950s and early 60s when they built Chase Manhattan Plaza. And over the course of time, that has been achieved in part because the existing older buildings are not really suitable for modern financial service companies who need all kinds of technological advances that are in the building, particularly today, even more than it was 20 years ago. And also they need large floor plates because of their trading floors, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was, it was realized that some of these older buildings, with some incentive from the government, like the J51 and 421 program, could be converted into residential units. And that stimulated people who wanted to go to work and walk to work.
To a 24/7 community.
And in fact, that has been a significant change.
Now, wasn't there one development that Zeckendorf was trying to do in Lower Manhattan a number of years ago that didn't come about near the seaport?
The young Zeckendorf, not
the second
Bill Senior, the
Zeckendorf,
second Zeckendorf.
Maybe
it may have been on the west side.
It was on the west side.
May have been on the east side, rather, on the east side. Now that is an interesting thing that happened. You know, the whole Water Street corridor was rezoned, and also the South Street Seaport was built with the concept that there would be a subway line there. In fact, the subway line was never built and may never be built. But in fact, the reason all of those office buildings were there was the theory was that the subway line would bring people right to that location. Water Street certainly turned out to be a successful real estate. Sol Atlas built the first building.
Right, without the...
And this was all in the 1960s, too. The two great initiatives in the 60s were the Water Street corridor and 6th Avenue, because those buildings are both in the 6th Avenue area and the Water Street were built in the 1962 to 1970.
Let's talk a little bit about family. You've been married to Susan for a number of years.
49 years.
And your wife is a world-renowned...
My wife is a scholar of the Holocaust. I'm very proud of my wife. Her first book won the Premio Acqui, which is, it's called The Italians in the Holocaust, and it's about what happened to Italian Jewry. And she won the finest book on Jewish history in that particular year. It was published, and since that time, she has written 5 books, one of which, if I give her a plug, is a biography of a priest called Pierre-Marie Benoit, which is going to be published by the University of Indiana Press in the fall. And it's the biography of a Capuchin priest who saved the lives of 4,000 people.
That's wonderful. Children?
Pardon me?
Children, sons,
children.
daughters?
I have 3 wonderful children. Our oldest daughter, Jana, who was married with 2 grandchildren. Our youngest daughter, Milena, who is married with 1 grandchild, and our son, who's married and has 3 grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren. We have 6 grandchildren.
So, you know, for the kid who grew up in the village, you know, who wanted to go to South America to help affordable housing, I think the word legendary was the right word. and I think, especially when you look at Lower Manhattan over here.
It's a great picture.
You know, it's
now imagine, you see there? You took that picture, that would all be piers. And it isn't 100 years ago, it was in our lifetime.
That's right. So when you look at that, you're truly building New York, and you have been a builder of New York. And thanks for being here today.
Okay. Thanks again, Mike. Bye.